unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you can by no means enter into the kingdom of God. That is the comparison point that we've been looking at as we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is making a contrast between what it is the scribes and the Pharisees are teaching, what it is they're doing, how it is that they're acting, which, remember, everybody would have looked at the scribes and Pharisees as the rock stars of the day. You know, those are the great ones. Those are the ones that you look to and you say, man, if I could only have half as much of the righteousness as Rabbi Gamaliel, now I would be a shoo-in. And Jesus says, yeah, not so much. Your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And as we've gone through, we've looked at how their teaching doesn't necessarily mesh very well with what was expected, with what God had given through the law of Moses. The teaching on murder, yeah, they would say you can't murder. Jesus says, yeah, well, it goes even beyond that. Don't even hate your brother in your heart. They would say, well, the law says to give a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus says, well, no, that's not exactly the point at all. In fact, that's in a larger section on just adultery in general. That, you know, they would say, don't even, you can't commit the act of adultery. Jesus says, don't even look at a woman with lust in your heart. The way that they used oaths in order to cheat people and manipulate the system. And as we talked about last week, the idea of taking their own vengeance, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus says, if they strike you, turn the other cheek. Allow yourself to be taken advantage of. Allow yourself to be persecuted for the sake of righteousness, as he talks about. Well, this morning we're going to continue through chapter 5, and we're now getting to the very last section of chapter 5 itself. This section is going to talk about, really, it's kind of unique in this section, or in chapter 5. Here Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Good morning. It's good to be here with all of you this morning. Good to have this opportunity to sing these songs together, to engage in this act of just coming before the presence of God together in the Spirit, to do so with all of us here, and also with all of those who are joining with us online, whether it be through YouTube or the Zoom that we are doing. It's just great to be here together. And really appreciate this opportunity that I have this morning to once again open up the Word of God and to continue looking at what citizenship in the kingdom is supposed to look like. And we're going to talk more about this very idea next week, as we see what Jesus' expectations are and what he's looking at. But when you look at the idea, what does a citizen of the kingdom look like? You find your best answers, really, to some degree, in Matthew's chapters 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. I appreciate you going through the Sermon on the Mount with me and spending some time looking at these things. For those of you who are visiting with us this morning, we're really glad you're here, and we appreciate the fact that you have chosen to be here with us this morning. It makes us feel special. We're glad that you're here. We're glad if you're visiting here in person, if you're visiting with us online and checking this out, whatever the case, we hope that you are encouraged by the time spent with us this morning. And I hope we're all encouraged as we continue through the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now this statement comes from Matthew chapter 5, and starting in verse 43, Jesus is talking, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he who makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? So we have here in this section, like I said, we're towards the end of Matthew chapter 5. If you got your Bibles open, you're looking at that, you can see we're right here at the end of this section. We've seen all the things, and really I think what we've seen is kind of a build-up to this very portion right here, and then the very last verse that we're going to talk about next week. It's all built up to this. Now, as always, before we start digging into what it is that Jesus is saying here, we need to go back and see what the law of Moses itself says about what he's talking about here, so we can try to determine what is it that the scribes and Pharisees might be correct about, but more importantly, what is it that they're doing wrong in the way that they are teaching this. So let's go back and let's go to Leviticus chapter 19. And by the way, verse 11 is kind of arbitrary as a starting point. Verse 18 is kind of arbitrary as an ending point. This is a larger section that's going on right here, which is all involved. Leviticus chapter 19, it's all involved and wrapped around this idea that Jesus is bringing out. But we're going to narrow it down to these verses in particular to take a look at where you find this teaching that the scribes and Pharisees are giving from the Old Testament. Leviticus 19, starting verse 11. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people. You shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, as we read through these, I'm hoping that you might have noticed a few phrases in here that sounded a little bit familiar. Even if you haven't spent much time in Leviticus 19, I know probably Leviticus 19 is everybody's daily reading every single day, right? You just, every day you're reading through this. Well, maybe not, but some of these phrases that you see, you shall not swear by my name falsely. Verse 17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Verse 18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. Did these sound maybe a little bit familiar? Is this not exactly what Jesus has been going through in Matthew chapter 5? Some of these very same ideas where he's saying, look, this is the way it was all the time. You shall not hate your brother. Where? In your heart. Remember, this isn't a new teaching. Jesus is not saying that the new law is spiritual and inside, whereas the old law was physical and on the outside. It was always this way. You were never supposed to hate your brother in your heart. Jesus is reminding them and saying, the Pharisees, that they've got the emphasis on the wrong syllable over here. You have to focus on what's really important, and that's what's inside. That's what Jesus is really bringing out. This whole section generally deals with this principle. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Generally speaking, people love themselves and they look out for their own self-interest. God is simply telling them, you need to look out for the interests of others as well, as much as you look out for your own. And this is pretty straightforward, and I think we get it here, right? I mean, this makes sense. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what's missing here from Matthew chapter 5? You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor. Yep, right there. So what's missing? And hate your enemy. Oh, all right. So we have love your neighbor here. But let's go ahead and let's turn over to the passage in the law of Moses where they got the second part of that, where they said, this is where you hate your enemy. And that's going to be found in, oh, hold on, let me check where, oh, it's not there. That's why. All right, I was like, man, I can't find that reference anywhere here. That's because it doesn't exist. He doesn't say that anywhere. He doesn't tell you anywhere in the law of Moses to hate your enemy. There's no point. He says love your neighbor, but there's no point where he juxtaposes that to how you treat your enemy. So why did they start teaching this? How did they come to get to this point where it says love your neighbor and hate your enemy? This, by the way, is just another reason why it's very clear Jesus is not comparing in the Sermon on the Mount the old law and the new law. This is not a comparison of the law of Moses to the law of Christ. That's not what's going on, because the law of Moses does not say hate your enemy. That's not a portion of what's going on. This is a comparison of the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees to what it should be, and that's doubly confirmed right here. So why do they say you shall love your neighbor but add hate your enemy? Well, I think it has to do with the fact that God very specifically said neighbor. He said, here's the one that you are to love. He specified your neighbor. And when something is specified within the Bible, we know when you have something very specific, what's not specified is not under discussion, right? You guys have heard the old illustration before, right? You know, if you order something out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and let's update that a little bit. That's been going around for a while. How about if you order something online from Amazon.com, right? You don't have to specify what you don't want. You just got to tell them what you want, right? I mean, here's the, I'm sure you guys are, all of you are familiar with the International Critical Commentary set that I don't know why I'm telling you this. Everybody knows this. They're updating them now because they were all written in the early 1900s, and they've been going through updating them. And yeah, I know everybody here, you guys are just eagerly awaiting the very next one that comes out, right? And here's the latest one, Ecclesiastes chapters 1 through 5, that was updated and put out last March. Now, for all of you, and probably some of y'all have already got your copies, I'm assuming, but if you were to get online and you were to purchase one of these, you would not have to tell Amazon, hey, I don't want the Exodus 1 through 18 commentary that came out last January, right? I mean, you don't have to tell them that. They already know that. I mean, you probably already have the 1 through 18. You got it the moment it came out. But we understand this principle, right? When you specify one thing, that means that you leave all the other ones out. We understand this. You've only authorized the one to be sent. Therefore, anything other than that is off limits. You're not buying that thing. So according to this logic, when God says, love your neighbor, then anything that is not your neighbor should not be receiving love. That is where the scribes and the Pharisees come up with, you shall love your neighbor, but your enemy, the one who's not your neighbor, you're not told to love him. Therefore, you must hate him. That is the basis, that's the argumentation, that's the principle that causes them to say, here's what the text says, you shall love your neighbor, which means that you should hate your enemy. So is that principle then properly applied here? Well, of course not, and we're going to see that in just a second. Is it possible that sometimes that principle that is so often used can be misused or misapplied? I think we absolutely have to understand that it can be, and I believe it was here. In fact, you look at Luke chapter 10, starting verse 25. You're familiar with the story. Jesus is talking. A lawyer stood up to test him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What's written in the law? How do you read it?" And the lawyer answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." You know, we often look at Matthew. In Matthew, Jesus is the one who gives the greatest commands, and we say, wow, this must have been revolutionary teaching from Jesus that he put out. Well, not necessarily, because one of the scribes says the exact same thing, right? You know, he's not parroting Jesus' words back at him. He's just saying, yeah, this is our understanding. Everyone understood. These are the two great commands. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. Even the scribes and Pharisees said, this is how you are to live. And Jesus says, yeah, you answered this right. Do this and you'll live. So what's the issue? Well, the issue comes out in verse 29 when it says this lawyer wanting to justify himself, wanting to make sure, you know, that he was well and good. He asked this question, and who is my neighbor? You know, it's not that the scribes and Pharisees didn't properly teach that you needed to love your neighbor as you loved yourself. They did that. The problem is that after making the statement, the discussion would then change to a discussion, who is my neighbor? Who is the one that I need to show this love towards? And if someone is not my neighbor, then that must mean I have to show hatred towards. So the discussion is, who is my neighbor? And more importantly, I think, who is not my neighbor? And we're not going to go through and talk about it, but you're familiar probably with the story of the Good Samaritan. You remember he told the story of the man who was left on the side of the road, and the priest went by, the Levite went by, and then a Samaritan took him, helped him, and paid for his nursing back to health. And he gets to the end of the story, and what does Jesus ask the lawyer? You remember his question, verse 36? He said, which of these three proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell upon the robbers? Remember, the original question was, who is my neighbor? Does Jesus answer that question? He doesn't, does he? He does not tell you who is my neighbor. He totally changes the question by the end of it. And he doesn't answer who's my neighbor. He asks the question, who proved to be a neighbor to someone else? He's not answering who is my neighbor. He's saying, who is it that acted as a neighbor towards someone? In other words, the point is not to bicker and argue over who your neighbor is. The point is to go out and live in such a way that when someone thinks of you, they consider you their neighbor. That's the point of the story. And that changes the whole discussion. The scribes and Pharisees were focused on determining who they had to think of as a neighbor so they could treat them with love. And Jesus, he changes it from saying, treat everyone with love, and they're going to consider you a neighbor. See, the scribes and Pharisees, it's a discussion of where to draw the proper line. And we talked about this before, right? Figuring out, what are my rights? What do I have to do? Tell me where that line is. Give me some kind of codified law by which I can say, here it is, and I won't pass it. And Jesus says, no, it's not the way to think of it. You go out and you prove to be a neighbor by how you treat everyone else. Jesus was focused on how you acted to everyone so they would see you as a neighbor. So coming back to Matthew chapter 5, do the Pharisees have this right? Love your neighbor and hate your enemy? Well, of course not. And I could have asked that question at the very beginning, and I could have had a show of hands and say, was he right, yes or no? And I think just about everyone would have said no. You don't love your neighbor and hate your enemy. What does Jesus instead say about enemies? Love your enemies. Pray for the ones who persecute you. Loving only the ones that you want to love is not the way of God. That's the way of the world. That's the way the world works. Remember last week we talked about who those enemies are, right? We talked about the ones who will persecute you. An enemy is the one who desires you harm. It's the one who is set against you to tear you down. This is the one who would strike you on the cheek and to whom you turn the other also. This is the one that would take you to court. This is the one who would ask you to carry his stuff for a mile. This is not your brother. This is your enemy. And here's Jesus' command. Love him. Pray for him. Folks, this is not standard fare, okay? This is not what the world would tell you. This is not, if you were honest with yourself, deeply honest, look inside yourself and be fair, this is not what you would tell yourself. You don't naturally feel this way about those with whom you are diametrically opposed. Just spend a little time doom scrolling on Facebook sometime or the social media du jour. Spend some time looking at it and see how often do people express this view as opposed to just tearing into each other. This is what God would tell you. How do we know this is what God would tell us? To love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you? Because Jesus is God, right? He told us. It came right from his mouth. But even beyond that, Jesus points out, God does not treat these people as enemies. God causes the sun to shine on them. God causes the rain to fall on them. And a lot of times we might associate, sun good, rain bad. I think it's all good because you need sun and rain in an agricultural society for it to work. He's saying that God doesn't say, okay, who are my people? I'm going to pinpoint the raindrops to hit their fields, and if they're not my person, you're not one of my people, then your field's going to go dry. God doesn't do that. He could. That is well within his power. We all understand that, right? But he doesn't. He treats them all exactly the same way. He benefits them exactly the same way. He treats the enemies the same way that he treats his people. And then he calls his people to do the exact same thing. And this, of course, is where it naturally becomes difficult. Because what does this look like? What does it look like to pray for your enemies? To pray for the ones who persecute? Well, I'm glad you asked because Jesus has an answer for that one too, apparently. He says, if you love only the ones who love you, if you greet only the ones who would greet you, he's talking about a picture of those who believe that they have a God-given duty to love their neighbors. But when it comes to their not neighbors, they have a duty to avoid them, to ignore them. And Jesus says, when you do this, you are no different from the rest of the world. If the only people that you ever greet, the only people you ever have a relationship with, are people that are exactly like you in your relationship with God, you're just like everyone else who only adhere to like-minded people. I'm going to throw up a couple mission statements that I find them interesting in the way that they are worded. First one from the Elks Lodge mission statement. To inculcate the principles of charity, justice, brotherly love, and fidelity. To recognize a belief in God, to promote the welfare and enhance the happiness of its members, to quicken the spirit of American patriotism, to cultivate good fellowship. Maybe change just a couple of words here, and couldn't that describe to some degree the way that a lot of people view Christian relationship? That, hey, we're all about getting together so that we can do these things. Or maybe this one, the Seattle Atheist Church, is a place where atheists come together to do church, to address the big questions, celebrate meaningful life events with atheist rituals. We celebrate the values of atheism, critical thinking, scientific naturalism, secular ethics, by teaching, learning, and thoughtful discussion. Again, change a few words here and there throughout this. Obviously, a church is not going to reject God and all of that. Change a few words, though. Could this not be the way that people look at church, where church is where a bunch of people get together, we're like-minded individuals, and we just come together, perform some rituals, do certain acts of worship, talk about certain things, and stuff like that? Practically, is that all our church is? A social gathering? We come together once a week, discuss things, a bunch of like-minded people with each other together here because we like being around each other? Folks, we don't have a monopoly on that. That's not revolutionary at all for us to say, hey, let's come together on a Sunday morning here and let's do these things so that we encourage and strengthen one another. All kinds of manners of groups do that. Now, it's important here, don't hear what I'm not saying. The relationships that we share with one another in this community together, these are vitally important. You heard me say that, right? These relationships are vitally important. Some of the absolute most important relationships that we have need to be in this circle. I firmly believe that the people that you put around you, and you give a license, you hand them a license and say, you are allowed to influence me and my behavior and my life trajectory, those people who are given those licenses should be the folks right here who want to go to heaven themselves and are going to do everything to help you get to heaven as well. Those should be the ones that are given those licenses. But here's the thing. Those should not be the only people that we have around us. We don't have the time to do it, but at some point read through one of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Pay attention to what Jesus does, where he goes. And if you do that, you might begin to see a side of Jesus that perhaps you didn't realize. Jesus spends a lot of time at parties. He really does. Jesus begins his miracles at a wedding. I know that's in John. It's not one of the synoptics, but take it for what it is. He begins his public ministry miracles takes place at a wedding. Consider how many times Jesus reclines to eat with the Pharisees or the tax collectors or the sinners, people that are well known in all of these areas. Folks, Jesus was an equal opportunity partier. He really was. And if you don't believe me, listen to what Jesus himself has to say in Matthew chapter 11, verses 18 and 19. It says, John came, neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came, eating and drinking. They say, look at him. He's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. See, Jesus here, he's defending himself against the scribes and the Pharisees who are providing argumentation that's just absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous. They're making unfounded accusations. And Jesus says, all right, come on. Y'all got to be fair. Y'all complained about John the Baptist because he never ate or drank in this kind of way, contextually, parties. So he couldn't have been from God. And now when I engage in coming and eating and drinking, you say, look at him, this guy parties too much. He's a friend of tax collectors. He's a friend of sinners. In other words, he doesn't care who's throwing the party. He's going to be there anyway. Well, that's the accusation that's levied. I think we can understand this, folks. Jesus was not a glutton or a drunkard. We're good there, right? Jesus is not claiming here to be a drunkard or a glutton. That was the unfounded accusation, but he does not deny that he went to those places where people might accuse him of such. He wasn't afraid to be found among the sinners, among the party, among this or among that, because of what people might say about him. They did say things about him, and he didn't care. His point here, the unfounded accusation he's saying to these guys is, y'all aren't going to be pleased with anything. So whether it's John on the one hand, me on the other, you're just looking for something to criticize. You're not being fair. But again, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting at all that Jesus was a party animal, as we might think of it, the Animal House frat boy type of thing. This is not the picture I want to present and have you leave saying, well, it sounded like Chris just thought, he was a party animal in this way. Folks, Peter went to these parties with Jesus, right? And we talked about this in our Wednesday class. Remember what Peter had to say? The time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, lawless idolatries. With respect to this, they're surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery and they malign you. What's his point? His point is, y'all used to do these things, but when you conformed yourself to Christ, you don't do these things anymore. So, is there any way that we could take this and say, well, Jesus must have engaged in all of these sinful activities that happen? No, not at all. Peter says it's wrong. Jesus did not do those things. Peter did not do those things. And these people say, he says you cannot do these things when you come to Christ. But then again, we need to understand this fact. Jesus did not simply hole himself and his disciples up for 3 years in a cave and teach them to be separate from the world. Jesus was out there. He accepted invitations. He apparently created invitations. He didn't turn away from others. Jesus never condoned sin, while at the same time he never rejected people. As Craig Blomberg, he's a New Testament scholar, he said it really well. He says, it remains striking how willing Jesus was to socialize, even in the intimacy of table fellowship, with anyone and everyone for the sake of accomplishing his mission. Think about that. What types of people might you be unwilling to socialize with? I know right now, COVID-wise, we can't socialize with these people anyway. So it's kind of a moot point right here in this moment. But think pre-COVID or maybe post-COVID. Think about it right now. Who are those people that you would be unwilling to socialize with? Who are those people that, they just grate at you when you think about it? Who is it that you wouldn't be caught dead around? Or if you were, you would certainly make sure, well, that's never going to happen again. Drunkards? Those from the LGBT communities? Maybe atheistic elites? Those of other religions and cultures, like Muslims or such? Democrats? Republicans? Antifa rioters, QAnon or Capitol Hill protesters, Biden supporters, Trump supporters. Who is it that when you think about them, it just makes your skin crawl just a little bit? Or maybe you just have no idea how to interact with this person, so you don't. Maybe blacks, whites, Hispanics, those in prison, those who have been released from prison, the homeless, sex offenders. Who is it? Folks, that's the tax collector. That's the sinner. That's the harlot. These are the people that Jesus accepted the invitations. Those are the very people Jesus did not simply tolerate. He dined with them. He went into their homes. He accepted. Again, he never accepts the sin. He never condones the sin. Even with the woman caught in adultery, at the end he says go, but he says go and sin no more. He never accepts their sin, but he accepts their personhood. He accepts that he has joined them in this brotherhood where we are all in the image of God. And he accepts the fact that they need him. If you want a good look at how little our society cares about those in different pockets of society, again, just spend some time on social media. Read through comments. Probably better don't read through the comments because they can just get sick. People are either cheerleading their own side or ungraciously tearing down the other side, no matter what the discussion is. There's no such thing as civil conversation. Now people simply hide behind the anonymity of a keyboard and spew whatever vomit that they want to, no matter how horrendous and how sick it is. All we have to do is simply dehumanize the other side with a label. They're no longer humans. We can say whatever we want to about them, and we'll just label them as this or that. It's been one of the greatest causes of division in our society. People just spend so much time looking at and spreading that propaganda. Justified or not, it's hate-filled vitriol that Christians should not be a part of. It's not our place to be a part of that problem. It's our place to be a part of the healing. We need to be that which is creating the power of God in these people's lives, not finding ways to tear it down. We shouldn't be the problem. Social media can be constructive. It can be useful. It can be helpful, and there are a lot of ways to make very positive use of it, but often it is not, especially among Christians, especially in this age of contempt that we live in. Again, Jesus never joins with any of them in their sinfulness. He never condones sinfulness. But folks, he joins with them anyway. You know, I have a confession. In St. Louis, there was a bar on the corner of the street where I had just basically, once I got going to get to the church building, took one road down, I made a right-hand turn, and, the church building was going to be a few miles on that road. And this bar right here, BJ's Bar, was right on the corner. Here's my confession. I never went into that bar. I drove by that bar more times than I think I could count in the 14 years plus I saw it. Oftentimes I thought about going inside, just sitting down at a booth, ordering a Coke, setting my Bible up, doing some studying in a booth, if they had booths, or tables, if they had tables, or whatever. I have no idea, because I never went in there. Why not, you ask? Well, it's because I was too afraid. First of all, what would the owner say if I set up shop and started studying my Bible and left it open for people to come and join with me to have discussions or whatever the case might be? Is that bad for business? Would I get kicked out? What would happen if there were people in there who noticed me and started becoming antagonistic towards me because I'm studying a Bible? But you know what? Those aren't valid excuses. I knew it at the time, because people are people. Just because they're in there doesn't mean that they're going to act in certain ways. People are people just like you and me. Those are just simply prejudices that I carried in that were unfounded. But you know what the one real rationale was that kept me outside of those doors? What would happen if someone from the church drove by as I was walking out from that bar? What would happen if someone were going to the bank that was catty corner? It was on the other corner. What would happen if someone was going into that bank and they looked over and they saw me in my car pulling out of that parking lot? Or if somebody was on their way to the hardware store and they drove by and I was standing talking to someone. I can remember years ago when a common hypothetical situation was given. Maybe you've even had this hypothetical discussion in your own past. What if your car breaks down in front of a bar? Is it okay to go into the bar in order to use the payphone? Anybody ever heard that discussion before? Or no? Well, I remember having this. Now, for those of you who are not aware, a payphone it's like a cell phone, except it's attached to something, and it's in public places you'd go, and you would put coins in it to, okay, well, coins are, forget it. Well, that's a totally different discussion, but think about it. The question is, can a Christian walk into a bar to use a phone? And the answer typically was one of two answers that I can remember. First, is there somewhere else that he can go to use the phone? He doesn't have to walk into that bar, right? I mean, is there a grocery store within a certain amount of space, or a gas station or something? Or for those who are more progressive, they would say, of course you can. I mean, you're just getting in, doing what you need to do, and leaving, right? That's the more progressive idea. You have those discussions. What does that say to everyone else? You'd better stay as far away from that place and those people as you possibly can. A man of God would never be caught dead in such a place. But what if there was someone here, a visitor, or a new Christian, or something, who goes to those kinds of places? What message are you giving to them? You're basically saying, you know what, you're not our kind of person. We don't want to have anything to do with you. And you have tainted yourself enough that we'd rather not be around you. What you're telling yourself about people that frequent this kind of place. You're telling yourself, those people are not worthy for you to be around. Those people are not worthy for you to shine your light upon them. And there is some truth in some fashion about problems going in there, and we have all kinds of caveats, and we'll talk about it sometime. It's going to come out. If you have a problem with drinking and alcohol, and that's an issue, yeah, you have no business going to such a place. We understand that. All right? All of that aside, generally speaking, I bet Jesus never would have had a problem walking into such a place, because those are the very kinds of places he walks into. Again, don't hear what I'm not saying. Jesus would never engage in sinful activities that might happen in such a place. I'm not at all suggesting that Jesus would have gone in there to get verschnickered, but I am suggesting Jesus would not have had a problem going into such a place if he expected there were lost people in there, and this is the point of connection where he might have an opportunity to save them. The people who come to places like that need Jesus just as much, if not more, than the people that you feel more comfortable having into your home and being around. Even more, they need to know that they are loved by Jesus, which only we can really show them. And if we refuse to be the ones to show them, how are they going to see it? You see, the scribes and the Pharisees had created such a hard stance on who was or who was not a neighbor. Who do I have to be kind to, and who can I kind of ignore and push aside and say, well, not that person? I truly believe they made enemies of those who really weren't enemies. But Jesus was such that he made friends with those who actually were his enemies. Remember what he says in Romans 5, while we were yet enemies, right? I mean, you have whole picture. Jesus, for even the worst of us, not only is Jesus willing to come to us, but just as you're reading through your gospel, noting how often it is that Jesus dines with sinners, note as well how often sinners feel comfortable coming up to Jesus. Notice how often Jesus gives himself out in such a way that the worst of society is willing to walk right up to him. Even willing to do it in ways when he's standing around a bunch of Pharisees who are like, who let this person in? Are you seriously going to let that person around you? And Jesus says, shut up. She's doing what she needs to do right now. Leave her alone because she is important. She is a person created in the image of God. And I don't care what she's done. She needs me just as much as anyone else. I guarantee these people never approached the scribes and the Pharisees. But they came to Jesus because Jesus proved to be a neighbor to them. If you show yourself as one who demonstrates disdain for certain people, can you ever expect those people will ever want to come to you? Remember the old adage, I'm sure you've heard it before, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And we need to be willing to show. Jesus tells his disciples and subsequently the crowds, scribes and Pharisees tell you to love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for the ones who persecute you. Act the same way your Father in heaven acts. You know, an interesting thing about enemies, it's stated, the story is there, in response to those who were annoyed that he was treating southern enemies so well with kindness and respect. Abraham Lincoln was reminded quite sternly that these are your enemies. You shouldn't be treating them so well. You should destroy your enemies. And he responded, apparently, this way the story is told, do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? They might be your enemies now, but if you follow what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, if he's hungry, give him something to eat. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be overcome with evil. Instead, overcome that evil with good. Remember, do not jeopardize your morals. Do not do what you know to be sinful. Do not go beyond a line that you have in your conscience that you understand between what is good and what is evil. Never cross that line. Never violate your conscience, but do not let your fear keep you from befriending those who do not hold your same morals. Befriending those who are sinful, who do go beyond that line that you have in your conscience. Folks, sin is not a contagious disease. You're not going to contract sin by being around them. Though if you do give them a license, remember we talked about that license that you hand to people to influence you? If you hand them that license, yeah, a little leaven leavens a whole lump of dough, right? You can't do that. But just being around a sinful person is not going to cause sin to rub off on you. But you know what is contagious? Love. And you have no idea how your love can change others' lives in very real ways. You may never know if you never allow yourself to come into contact with them. Folks, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Let's pray together. Our great, holy, and awesome God, hallowed is your name. Though truly holy and set apart from all sinfulness, all wickedness, you still sent your Son, the Word, God, to take on flesh, to join with us. How amazing and incredible was the gift given that God himself would associate with the lowly, with humanity, with sinners. Father, help us to be like your Son. Help us to see the opportunities available to us to live like he lived and to share in the fellowship that he shared in with those who need a relationship with you the most. We thank you for Jesus, for his example, for his life, and most importantly, for his death and resurrection, which gives us a hope. We thank you for heaven. And it's in the name of Jesus we now pray. Amen.